Thank you so much, Hilda, for the introduction and just even earlier, the inspiring, holistic, just amazing talk you gave. Yeah, so, and Sina as well. It's just a great honor to be here. Joel, of course, is a great hero for all of us. And as a farmer especially, nothing could be more sacred, nothing could be more important than, of course, getting the food from God's green earth as intended, which is a very difficult thing to do these days, and yet essential for our health. So a lot of my work over the years has been about trying to understand the new biology, if you will. And one of the things about the new biology is that food is information. It's not just a source of calories or building blocks for our body. You think about minerals and vitamins and protein and carbohydrate and fat. But the reality is that food puts information into our body, and when you alter it, as we know with genetic modification, we're actually altering our species in our own bodies, and that's leading to, of course, epidemic levels of poor health and all the things that we want to avoid. So over the years, I've dove very deep into the topic. I'm sort of like a researcher in terms of what I love doing. I've spent way too much time in front of a screen, which is why it's just so incredible to be here with you in the open air. In fact, I wasn't going to wear my shoes because I wanted to give a talk barefooted the first time ever. Well, I do it at home. I just usually live stream, so you can pretty much be wearing your boxers and a suit top. No one notices, but here, yeah, maybe I will. I got okay, cool. Anyway, it does feel like this is a tribe, and it just feels amazing to connect on a soul level with all of you, because in the past, obviously, 4 years or so, it's been a harrowing experience that we have all faced, being in many ways coerced or forced to be isolated and in our own little boxes. And so it's just an incredible moment we live in right now, that we are, many of us, newly convicted and newly just grateful for very simple things like being able to breathe without a mask on, right? That was a really big issue, even in Miami, which now is pretty freedom-oriented. I remember a young lady was on the beach and she got arrested, in the beginning of the declared pandemic for not wearing a mask. And we can all remember that, right? It was really bad, what was going on. And as some of you have noticed, they're already starting to ramp up the contracts with Moderna and Pfizer for the bird flu vaccine. So, and also the media is starting to promote once again the MK Ultra conditioned, news cycle around, of course, the next so-called pandemic. So hopefully today I can talk on some of these topics and hopefully disabuse you, as I have myself, of many of the myths associated with health, which are now being used in a way that is not really reflective of a search for truth, but really as a form of control. And there's this amazing quote by Benjamin Rush. It's attributed to him as well that I just wanted to recite. He said, "Unless we put medical freedom into the Constitution, the time will come when medicine will organize itself into an undercover dictatorship." Yeah, sounds like Fauci, right? When they say deep state, they mean the permanent state, because he was, there pulling the strings for 6 consecutive administrations. So you get to see, I think Frank Zappa said that the politics is the entertainment division of the military-industrial establishment, right? So that's what we're talking about here. That's the undercover dictatorship he was concerned about. So he said, to restrict the art of healing to doctors and deny equal privileges to others will constitute the Bastille of medical science. All such laws are un-American and despotic. So that's the context, because very few of us, like farmers and natural health advocates, chewing our carrots and advocating for turmeric, right, and eating chicken broth, thought we would be considered terrorists or that our governments would define us as such. But that's one of the interesting stories about my own experience being an advocate for natural health. I started out very long ago looking at Centrum, a multivitamin that Bayer produces, actually, which is actually a spin-off of IG Farben. So it's literally part of that whole history going back to Nazi Germany. And they produced a vitamin that contained all these inorganic chemicals that are literally pollutants, like chromic chloride and cupric sulfate, which you mentioned, as a form of copper, and forms of, vitamins like DL-alpha tocopherol, which are petroleum. And no wonder when people take Centrum, they feel sick, right? Yeah, but thankfully, they're not absorbing it because it's usually encased in magnesium stearate and inorganic, materials. But at that time, I was just really made aware of how the chemical industries spin off, these patented chemicals, which are pharmaceuticals, and ultimately have convinced the public that they, need to take really what are generally deadly chemicals in order to be healthy. And so there's been many decades and even centuries of conditioning around how we relate to our own bodies, that we willfully poison them the moment we have a fever, or the point during the declared pandemic when, if you had a fever over 102, they would have potentially quarantined you, and using this like automated software, which is still being deployed, and arguably turn you into patient zero for the next pandemic, because they had redefined having a body with a microbiome, which is, your body is 99.9% germ, as if that's a form of bioterrorism. It's just simply having a body that happens to have these particles that sometimes are described as viruses, sometimes as exosomes. So, wow, what an experience that has been. And we're still in it. The World Health Organization just went ahead and decided that this new global, pandemic treaty is now valid. And, the idea is that one person, could be Tedros, can decide that there's a new global pandemic that we have to lock down over, right? And I don't know if you remember this, during the whole monkeypox scare, there was like a tie. I don't know if it was 8 people voting, and he decided to break the tie. This one guy, is a buddy of Bill Gates, the WHO being funded primarily by Bill Gates in terms of singular contributors that aren't governments. And it's just, you can't make this stuff up. It's like science fiction. But anyway, going back to the thing I was asked to talk about, as I tend to spin off quite a lot, is this alternative toxicological risk model. Now, my dad, I wish he could be here today. He's a beautiful man. He actually is a toxicologist and pharmacologist. And so for some time, I think I worked out some of my, conflicts with my father through even the work that I do, because I was always 100% natural, and I was always, really disturbed by, my father popping an aspirin or cutting open rats to study the effect of these drugs on them. Very dispassionate thing, vivisection. You think that you're not harming anything or anyone, but the karma tends to blow back in that model on us humans. Anyway, but he taught me a lot, and I was able to really appreciate that things are way wrong as far as how we think about toxicity. And of course, Paracelsus, 16th century Swiss, medical individual who was also an alchemist and all these other great things, he's the one who we assign this dose makes a poison concept. And it's still prevalent, as people think, right? The more of something you are exposed to, the more toxic, the less toxic. It's a very simple concept. And generally, that's how these industries that pollute the environment and then put very harmful things into our food and water and supplements get away with it, because they're looking at like a no observed level of harm with their model when they try to deploy these sorts of chemicals or whatever additives they are. But what I've discovered is that things are actually, in many ways, much worse. And before I go too deep down that rabbit hole, I promise you that tomorrow I'll be focusing a lot on the solutions, which are profound. And I'll start by saying that the body is just an incredible miracle, because every day that I wake up and I'm still breathing and I feel relatively well, knowing what I'm exposed to, I mean, it's pretty amazing that we have this insane resilience in every, atom of our body. And so when you start learning about the harms of the things we're exposed to, they constitute these little micro traumas, like little paper cuts. You could end up bleeding to death by this information because it's pretty significant. So just keep in mind that the balancing factor is that our body is so much more miraculous and powerful than like anyone has ever told us. And the new biology actually shows us how that's true. And of course, the amazing speakers here today and others in the audience, I know quite a lot about all of this. So the basic premise here is that the body, when poisoned, which other speakers have spoken to today, tends to express symptoms. So even influenza symptomology is actually also a form of bodily self-regulation and or detoxification. And that's why when you start understanding your symptoms as intelligent, and of course not again the precondition for ground zero for the next pandemic that's going to kill half the world, that's literally what they've constructed for people, right? Is that you start to feel a sense of safety and even like a sense of curiosity and great appreciation for your body. Many people can't even get an acute set of symptoms because they're so sick and their body's so accumulated with toxicity. That's why I really loved your talk, because he's showing us, Dr. Leland showing us that the hair will exude these toxicants and metals when given an opportunity, but you aren't necessarily aware of how much hard work it's doing to make sure those poisons and those compounds are being pushed off into other tissue. The body's so intelligent. So when it comes to fasting, for example, we know that Arnold Ehret is a very famous raw foodist from, I don't know, the early 1900s. He used to say you dig your graves with your teeth, and he was referring to the fact in his system that many of the foods we consume today, which he called like mucus-forming foods, are really being eaten for recreational and addictive reasons. Food is just such a divine thing, and when you experience that sensuality, that connection, that sense of being alive, then that's what often keeps us going in life. But the reality is that many of us have never even really broke the fast, right? Like we've never, meaning every day you break the fast, right? What I'm saying is that fasting, when done properly, will actually start digesting the least healthy tissue first, including things like even tumors, leaving intact the healthy tissue. So you really do need to give yourself that break. But the point is that the body is extremely intelligent. It will coordinate off a ton of toxicity into tissues that would, if it was in the blood or if it was in fast replicating cells, would cause a lot of harm. But we are all in this situation together in terms of having to address this really big 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is that almost all modern medical diagnoses are related to, either deficiencies of certain key foods or nutrients or toxicity, and the major gaslighting that goes on is the insertion of this really quite pseudoscientific concept that most disease that isn't obviously caused by those factors is being caused by, say, an invisible particle. So Dr. Cowan does such a great job with this, by the way. Yes, it's called terrain, meaning the cell and its health or lack thereof is largely going to determine whether you get sick or not. When a cell starts to break down, it gives off these little particles. There's a range of them, actually. They're called apoptotic bodies. The cell's going through programmed cell death. It's a graceful process of self-disassembly. It's had enough. It's either, lived through its life cycle, it's been damaged too much, and it's like, I'm going to go die, and then the stem cell is going to come regenerate and spit out a nice, new, perfect, differentiated cell. That's the way it should be. There's necrotic bodies. Again, these little nanoparticles of cells give off when the cell is harmed. And there's exosomes, which are this like constant galaxy of particles given off by cells that are in the same range as conventional viruses. They have, lipid bilayer membrane. They contain nucleic acids just like everyday viruses. In fact, they're indistinguishable in most cases. What I'm trying to point out is that when a cell's sick, it's breaking down. It's either signaling other cells in the body, hey, something's going on. I need to go ahead and fix this. Or it's just going to go die. what happens, it's like blaming the firefighter for the fire that's just responded to, right? So the virus is blamed for the fact that the cell has been experiencing a lifetime of damage, or the 10,000 chemicals we've been exposed to daily, or the 800 non-native EMF signals that it's being whacked with. And it's just such an amazing gaslighting that's been going on for how long, is to believe that viruses are the cause for all the things that are in our face, destroying our cellular health, that we can actually change and say, no, we're not going to take those smart meters, we're not going to allow the chemicals in our diet. So it's just trying to get back to, once again, understand the basics of cell health, and realizing that much of the modern medical way of thinking is actually a form of sorcery. And it's really literal. I think some of you will appreciate this, the Christians here, because Revelations, which I think many of you in the past 4 years, right, that went through it wasn't like every day a new phrase of the Revelations. Like, right? Literally. I mean, and so one of those phrases is just so amazing. I always go back to it. It's from Revelations 18:23. It's, at the end of times, the merchants of the world will deceive the nations through their pharmacia. I mean, I wasn't raised a Christian, but I'm like reading the Bible to try to understand what's going on with the CDC, right? I mean, seriously. Yeah, I mean, some call it Pharmageddon, right? But what's so fascinating about this is that if you go to the word origin, right, the etymology, it comes from the Greek word pharmakos. In ancient Greek religion, what they would do is they would take a human scapegoat, it'd be a slave, a cripple, a criminal, or a witch, whatever they want to call the herbalists at the time, who was chosen and expelled from the community at times of disaster, famine, invasion, plague, or at times of calendrical crisis when purification was needed. So the word was actually originally, it was for human sacrifice, symbolic or actual. And then later, the term became pharmakous, which refers to a drug, spell-giving potion, druggist, prisoner, by an extension of magician or sorcerer. So yeah, that's even where the word pharmacology comes from. So it's fascinating. Like when you go into words and look at the root origin or etymology, it's what you could describe as the mythos versus the logos. Everyday, ordinary life, we use these words, and if you just look a little bit deeper beneath the surface, you often get the real meaning. And it's profound. Because ultimately, if you think about it, whoever it was, or whoever these people were who, for years ahead of time, orchestrated the closing down of the world, right? Without even a single bullet fired. They did it because allopathic thinking is actually a form of sorcery. And it's based on delusion. It literally means not the symptom, meaning they're not focusing on the symptom the way you would in a naturopathic tradition. Like your kid gets a fever, you want to hydrate them, you want to show them love, you want to make sure that maybe even they have a blanket to sweat it out. You don't freak out and give them an antipyretic like Tylenol, which is the #1 reason why people die from liver poisoning in this country, or why they have psychiatric issues because of the association with Tylenol and autism incidents, as well as the fact that it dampens empathy, has true psychiatric consequences. And that's just looking at Tylenol. So when you try to suppress the symptom, one of the, again, wonderful things my colleague and friend, Dr. Thomas Cowan, shows us is that if the body's trying to eliminate a burden of toxicity that's accumulated in the tissues, and even the cells are overrun with this stuff, what does it do? The gel state of the water in our body, right? Because that's the cool thing. If I get poked by something sharp, all the water doesn't just leak out, right? I'm supposedly 99.9% water by number of molecules in my body. It's a gel, and it's in hexagonal sheets, and it's actually H3O2, not H2O2O. And it basically, when you heat it, it's able to liquefy and get out some of those toxicants and other metals, etc., all kinds of pesticides that are in that cell. And it's a survival mechanism. Because if you reach a certain point where even your bones and your fat, your hair has too much poison in it and your cells are accumulating it, good luck. That's when really severe chronic issues like cancer, for example, start to pop up. The cell's just responding to the so-called tumor microenvironment, right? This the whole epigenetic model, which is that cancer is a response to an already very sick modern situation, right? You're not sick because you have cancer, you're already sick, and cancer is just an expression and even an adaptation to that, meaning cancer is a regenerative process in the body. It's very similar to if you have inflammation you're trying to heal, and it's shouldn't be looked at actually as evil and a foe. Better to understand it. Okay, so slide. These slides will go quick. I don't really usually like to do slides because I tend to collapse into them, but it helps me a little bit stay focused. So this is just a few models, of toxicity, this dose response concept where you have in, the figure A, a certain response occurs after a threshold is reached, like a certain amount of toxicity, and suddenly you actually see, oh wow, I have a symptom, I'm toxic. The second one, B, is that right from the get-go, there's a response that correlates with the dose given, and a greater response, the greater the toxicity. And then there's the nonlinear responses where maybe initially you get an effect from being exposed and then suddenly you don't. There's a lot of complexity to the field of toxicity, and this is just the scratching the surface. But over the years, what I've been really shocked by, and like I said, some of the information may be a little traumatizing, but ultimately the story at the end is that our bodies are incredibly resilient and capable of miracles, literally, especially if we have the right mindset. But it is important to note that there was a study back in 2013. By the way, this is why Bayer and Monsanto hate me and Green Info so much. And we're literally getting like the military trolling us, and all kinds of crazy stuff happened to so-called GMO activists because we reported on information like this. So this was a parts per trillion range concentration of glyphosate caused an estrogenic response in a breast cancer cell. And this is an example of when you have a high dose of Roundup in a cell, you might actually have that cell go through, again, programmed cell death. It's like, you know what, I'm so poisoned, the only thing that I can do here to help the whole body is to just die. Let a new one take over. But if you have smaller concentrations, sometimes that's going to lend it to act more like a hormone or endocrine disruptor, which then can cause a phenotypal change of that cell so that it does exhibit cancerous activity. So parts per trillion is really concerning because you consider that since it's 1992 to 2002, there was, I think, 1.4 billion pounds of Roundup that were sprayed in the U.S. 1.4 billion pounds. And I mean, at a 1 in a trillion concentration, you can kind of see the implications when it's in most rainwater samples. Our bodies have it. And again, that's why when you get into this topic, it's like, oh, geez, this is really traumatizing even to know this, and that's not the point. We'll have, something positive to say at the end of this. The other one is radiation risk. Because of Fukushima, I spent like a year researching this because I was seriously concerned. The Fukushima event was actually a nuclear event. The plutonium went around the world, within a matter of days. And whether you know this or not, there are fourth-generation nuclear weapons that are being deployed in the world right now. And unfortunately, people don't know about it. They don't produce fallout. They're considered almost quasi-conventional because they can target bunkers, but they're using enriched uranium. It's basically a nuclear type of technology. And so I work with one of the individuals who wrote up the radiation risk model that is most accurate today, and it's known as the European Committee on Radiation Risk Model, and it's Dr. Chris Busby. And his work was based on the fact that when they were first trying to figure out the risk of radiation, which applies to all the devices that we're exposed to, like cell phones, these are emitting radiation that are microwaves. It's a 2.4 gigahertz, right? Same as a microwave, so that's why a cell phone will heat your head within a matter of a few minutes. Like it's really sad that we're using these technologies without knowing what they're doing. But at the time that they were developing the International Commission on Radiological Protection Guidelines, right, ICRP, which are the ones that are used throughout the world today, which are the ones that justify the use of uranium-238 depleted uranium munitions throughout the world. They're using this very dense material to try to pierce armor. So throughout the Middle East, it's being used. And unfortunately, when they developed the guidelines to say that this is okay, because uranium-238 is a weak alpha particle emitter, they don't give off gamma radiation, is that they were basing all their studies on Hiroshima and the effects of an atomic blast on tissue from the outside in. It's almost like just being burned. Now they found, because that was 1940, 5 till 1953 is when this research was conducted. DNA was only discovered in 1953. So the guidelines were set for the world, and they've been ongoing for 70 years based on atomic blast survivors. Now we know now the difference is that when you're, say, exposed to heat from the outside, okay, we all know what it feels like. The difference is like uranium-238 is like swallowing a hot coal, and it's staying in your body forever. In fact, I mean, there are mechanisms to get it out, and that's why day 2 will be more encouraging, because something as simple as eating an apple can actually help with that. It's profound. But is that 238 is being released through things like on reservations, like a lot of the mining going on there. It's pretty prevalent at this point throughout the food supply, and it is one little atom is enough theoretically to cause cancer. So when I was researching this, of course, I was just like, oh, this is just way too much, I was really starting to freak out. But as you'll see later, our body actually has the capability, thanks to the microbiome and the mitochondria, to detoxify radionuclides. And that's a relatively recent discovery, which is profound, actually, like really, because uranium-238 has a half-life of 4.4 billion years, right? That's older than the Earth, according to the conventional view, right? So Dr. Chris Busby identified that relative to the prevalent toxicological risk model for radiation, the new one shows that uranium-238, when it's inside your body, again, considered relatively safe, is 55,000 times more toxic than presently acknowledged. So it's such a big problem, guys. I mean, uranium-238 goes right to the nucleus of the cell. It goes right to the DNA. So it's a big deal. The military-industrial establishment, in large part, knows about this. I mean, it's all over really the world now, thanks to what they're doing. And it's just another reason why people need to understand that the lower the concentration of something can have a far higher effect than anyone really could presently imagine or acknowledge. So that's one of those things that, okay. So then again, another example, antiperspirants, the aluminum that people are putting on their pores to try to block up the sweat pores so you don't obviously sweat, one of the best ways to detoxify. And I mean that, in fact, day 2, it's one of the best protocols to dump out the accumulated toxicants, is acting as a metalloestrogen. So many women specifically, but men are still also dealing with a huge problem with cancer overdiagnosis of the prostate. But for so-called breast cancer, I spent a good decade trying to give women information on what is one of the most commonly overdiagnosed conditions that women confront, which is breast cancer, because of mammography campaigns that took asymptomatic women, right, healthy breasts, and said, we gotta scan your breasts with x-rays and see if you have cancer. And that whole asymptomatic, carrier concept that you're familiar with from the COVID years, it's been prevalent for some time. Again, when you start to actually have a relationship with your body where you have a sense of health, you're less likely to go outsource that when you're not having symptoms to the medical system and get, preemptive scans and prophylactic tests. That's a big thing that's going on right now. And of course, in some cases, how can I argue it's not life-saving? When you're choosing that path, you wouldn't know what would have happened had you not found it. The concept of overdiagnosis, though, when it comes to breast, prostate, lung, thyroid, is that many of the tests are seeing tissue abnormalities. In the case of breast cancer, ductal carcinoma in situ, right? DCIS is now no longer actually defined as cancer and should never have been. And it wasn't until 2013 the National Cancer Institute recognized that. But yet 2 million women lost their breasts because of that misunderstanding. And even today, women are not being told that DCIS, which usually comes up, again, asymptomatic women see calcium in the x-ray, and they're told, hey, to be careful, we need to take the breast out or do a lumpectomy, follow up with radiation and chemo. One of the most basic causes of these abnormalities is as simple as applying an antiperspirant with aluminum, because these small concentrations mimic our hormones and actually have a harmful effect. There's a lot around this topic. By the way, for years, I've put a lot of this information on greenmedinfo.com because it can be a little bit overwhelming. And to do the topic justice, I could probably use a whole hour just talking about this one piece, because women have been so disproportionately targeted by the medical system. There's like an embedded institutional misogyny that goes back, back to the time when, doulas and midwives and herbalists were the ones who were keeping us all alive. But I have a lot of writing on that topic. So let's just summarize by saying that when it comes to concentrations of very small amounts of metals, including in products like Centrum, like I said, they put tin in there, there's sodium selenate, chromic chloride, copper sulfate. These are industrial pollutants that they would have to pay to take care of, like nuclear waste, right? It's very expensive. Instead, they lobby the FDA, they lobby, political system, and they get it redefined as a nutrient with GRAS status from the FDA. But we as consumers have to be aware of that and make sure that we are consuming vitamins and minerals that are from food sources, right? That's the ideal. And if you're going to take a supplement, hopefully that's concentrated food. Yeah, the energy in here really went down, didn't it? I don't even want to talk about this stuff anymore. Okay, yeah, it's not going to be much longer. Okay, so low level exposure to EMF. So there's such denial still going on with telecommunications and regulators around cell phone radiation, and most of the people here probably have it in their pocket. I don't know. I would just say that it's definitely clearly been documented and validated that EMF from cell phones has a lot of, there are a lot of problems. We have over 1,000 studies on GreenMedInfo on electromagnetic field harms, and have spent so many years accumulating the data on it. We have way more research on things that you can protect yourself from those harms with, and things as simple as propolis from the beehive. That's the mortar that the bees use to protect their hive from electromagnetic adversity. So basic things that we're doing already are protecting us, trust me. But I do want to point out that so-called low level, it's usually a misnomer, that again, low levels can have very high effects, non-linear effects. I'm almost done actually with this part, okay? So this is a very interesting fact, but before the COVID mRNA vaccines, right? And they're not really vaccines, we know that. Sometimes we can call them technologies, but you're transfecting a human cell. It's a transhumanistic event, and you're trying to get that cell to produce an antigen on it as if it is a vaccine. So that's what we're talking about with mRNA vaccines. So the good news is if you were someone who took one, every day you've moved past that event, you are better and better off in theory, as long as you're continuing to support your health, your mental well-being, you're detoxifying, you're exercising. That's the beauty of it. There are many people who did take it, including my own father, that I'm still helping him with, who's recovered dramatically. He should have probably died from the heart effects of that. But it's amazing what the body can do. We are incredibly strong and regenerative, and that's how we'll end this talk. So, but the reality is that when you look at vaccines like Gardasil, this was the first one that was approved without any human studies being performed whatsoever, okay? There was never one cervical cancer case that was prevented by Gardasil before they released it. Just like these mRNA technologies, there were no human studies, right? That set the standard, actually. They use surrogate markers of efficacy, like how many antibodies they can measure after they just inject you with all types of really toxic compounds. It's like kicking a beehive of your humoral immunity, and all these antibodies fly out looking to try to attack something, and it's usually your own self-structures, right? That's why vaccination and autoimmunity are it might as well be synonyms as far as I'm concerned, is that each one of those doses contained 7 micrograms of yeast, which doesn't sound like a lot, but on a molecular level, that's a lot. And essentially, there is a homology between yeast. In the research community, it's called a mini mammal, because many of the same genes and proteins created are the same found in the human genome. In fact, 20 to 30% of yeast is the same as the human nuclear makeup. In fact, we're more similar to fungi than we are anything else, right? Plants or anything else. So that means that if you inject that yeast into a human, because route of exposure is essential, that's another argument against all vaccines in terms of injection, is that the body will produce antibodies to those proteins, and there's no way it can tell whether that protein is self or other. So my point here is that there's probably it's like getting 1,000 to 1,500 vaccines simultaneously. That's how much antigenicity, or how many antigens that are identical in yeast to humans in one vaccine. So no wonder it caused so much harm, in those who receive them. And that's, of course, true for diploid vaccines, which many of you, being of Christian faith, right, don't believe in abortion, but they've intentionally harvested fetuses from women in order to create the seed stock. They're called diploid cells, right, because they have the 2 sets of chromosomes, right? And the FDA acknowledges that diploid cells, let's say in the MMR vaccine, were used and are still there, and there's about 10 nanograms of that genetic material in each vaccine. And that acts a lot. That's a lot. That's actually, that's about, 1,667 diploid cells can fit within 10 nanograms. So if the body's holofractal, so each cell contains really an entire human being. It's just this miracle. So you have one human cell you're injecting in, throwing in these adjuvants, etc., and you're getting your body to react to a holofractal miniature of another human body, of a fetus that was aborted, like ruthlessly. You can imagine just even the energetic consequences and spiritually of doing that. No wonder, it caused so many individuals to experience, autism. Like, that's one of the things, of course, you can't even speak to, but that was an obvious consequence and has been and will continue to be with this very outdated methodology for vaccine production. That's also what encouraged them to develop the Gardasil vaccine, because they wanted to produce non-cell-based, genetically modified yeast-derived antigen. And of course, the next evolution, which was DARPA 2012, aligned with Pfizer and Moderna to produce the present mRNA vaccines, and they're now realigning for the contracts for the avian flu vaccines, is that they wanted to create a option so that you could turn again human cells into vaccine antigen manufacturing plants, which is just really science fiction, but that's what they did. So ultimately, the principle here that applies, how all this happened, was the weight of evidence standard is applied, where once a manufacturer puts all this junk into our lives, it's up to the people experiencing the side effects and being harmed to say, hey, wait a second, something's wrong. The precautionary principle is like, if there's even a cell study that indicates that one of these things is harmful, it should be on the manufacturer to prove in human studies that it's safe. And that's unethical to do anyway, but it's all inverted. But still, many are starting to advocate for the precautionary principle when it comes to toxicological risk. Okay, we got through that. Great, congratulations. That's, wow. So tomorrow is all about positive, awesome stuff around how all the things I just told you are completely decentered and minimized because of the God-given miracle of our bodies and the technology that we have within us. And so much of it is actually around mindset and belief. So I think it was Sina that was talking about this, but when it comes to healing, and I'm going to be ending here in a minute, is that the nocebo and placebo effects are the most powerful ever observed in medicine. So that basically, if you believe that something is helpful for you, it's very likely to do that. And if you don't, then it's very unlikely to. My understanding is that the rate limiting step for true healing and remission from anything is not really, just believing it's true. It's not even willing. It's, are you willing to do the work? It's whether or not you feel worthy. And so that piece is super profound, is that so many of us have been socially engineered and traumatized inadvertently, even sometimes intentionally, that we just don't feel we're worth it. We have too much guilt and shame. And that's really where the miracle starts to come in, is when we start to identify that and clear that, that's when, you start to experience a whole nother level of health and regeneration, where you can start to literally reverse your biological age, and just open yourself to the types of joy that we're all here to experience. So once again, thank you. Just so you know, when it comes to my work, there's so much that I want to share that I can't because I just don't have the time or format, but I do have a master class called Regenerate Yourself. I've had a ton of people take it. They love it, and I go into the principles in my book around regeneration. And for anyone who wants to go ahead and use or take that, it's half off for anyone from Polyface. It's only like $50 to take it. It's like 3 years of work. It's incredible. I think it's actually helped a ton of people. So if you want to dive deep and even go into intentional movement and food as medicine, culinary practices, that's a lot of what I focus on, not so much what I just talked about. But tomorrow, like I said, hope that I see you here and we can focus on some of those amazing solutions that I want to deliver for you. Thank you.